Then my next two guests. Robert Anderson worked for Mueller for 12 years. He's a former executive assistant director of the FBI. He served as the FBI's top counterintelligence official. And Greg Brower was the FBI's top liaison to Congress. He was also a U.S. attorney. Thanks to both of you for being with us. Bob, let me just start with you. You know Robert Mueller better than anybody who's going to be on this show tonight. All of this, the DOJ guidance that he should stay within the bounds of the report, his apparent intention to stay within the bounds of the report, his reluctance to testify in the first place. You know him well. Do you expect any surprises from him tomorrow?
No, thanks, Steve. I don't really expect any surprises. It doesn't surprise me at all, however, that he's asked for guidance for DOJ, and he's looking at this hearing sort of like any other hearing he's testified at, where he's a kind of a by-the-book guy. There's no doubt. I mean, for 12 years I worked for him. I ran numerous very high-level investigations, and that's the one thing that Bob will give you every time is consistency. I think he's going to go in there. I think he's going to stick to the four corners of his report, but I do think it's a good opportunity for Congress to walk the American people through that report. I'm probably one of the few guys that have read it page to page. One, because I had to testify about it in Congress about a month ago, but two, also just to understand the investigation. There's a lot of information in there that I think Congress can really educate the American people on.
Greg, given what Bob is saying right there, for a member of Congress on that committee tomorrow, if you're trying to maximize the information you get out of it and the analysis maybe you get out of Mueller, what's the best way to approach it? What kind of questions do you ask him?
Well, let me just say, first of all, Steve, I agree with everything Bob just said, but with respect to the particulars of the hearing, if I was asking the questions, I would want to be very, very concise, much like I would if I was examining a witness on the stand in a trial, ask very short questions, ideally questions calling for yes or no answers. But I would try to get substantively at three particular areas. One is to get Mr. Mueller to emphasize what his team found with respect to attempts at coordination between the Trump campaign and the Russians, and there's a lot there. It's all in the report. Secondly, I would want Mr. Mueller to testify as to the extent to which witnesses lied about those connections. And third, and perhaps most importantly, I would want to establish on the record with the witness the extent to which the Mueller team found that the president attempted to obstruct the investigation. There's a lot there in the report, and I think it's incumbent upon Mr. Mueller to give that story in a compelling fashion in this hearing.
There's an expectation tomorrow that one of the questions that's going to come up maybe repeatedly is a form of this. If the president were anybody but the president and the facts of the case were the same, would he be charged with obstruction of justice? Would Mueller have recommended charging him with obstruction of justice? James Comey was actually on in the last hour with Nicole Wallace here on MSNBC. He mentioned that possibility. Here's what he had to say.
If this were a case about someone who, other than the president, they'd already have been indicted on at least several of these obstruction incidents, maybe all of them, I don't know. But Director Mueller, I think, if pressed, would reach a decision, at least on some of them, that there is sufficient basis to charge the president. But again, he's a principled person trying to be fair and said, I shouldn't be doing that, given that the man can't vindicate himself.
So, Bob, Democrats pursuing that line of questioning tomorrow. Is there any chance they can get a yes out of Mueller?
I got to tell you, I think it's slim to none. I agree with what Jim said, and Jim was the third director I worked for before I retired. I just think that Bob Mueller, as Jim said about being principled, it's absolutely dead nuts on. He looks at this as a very principled way, and I don't think that you'll get him to say that in testimony tomorrow.
Let me just ask you, though, I'm curious, too, again, just given your vantage point, this knowing him so well, we know he's reluctant to testify. We heard what he said at that press briefing a couple of months ago right now. There's all this talk out there that, hey, if you read the report, Mueller's clear as day. He meant this as an impeachment referral. Clearly, in the court of public opinion, there's a lot of that. That's a disputed concept. If your Mueller if that was your intent, is there any temptation here to just come out and make that clear?
Yeah, I think there's a temptation, but I got to tell you, he's a very measured man, and he's a very smart man. And by the way, there's no doubt in my mind, after testifying about his report and reading his report several times, that he did make that report for referral to Congress or others to look at, either while the president is in office or afterwards. There's no doubt in my mind. And one of your other hosts brought up Aaron Zebley, who's probably one of the best attorneys I've ever met, and I've known him for years. The team that he assembled when he took on this challenge to investigate these allegations is bar none. So I do think the background that the Congress has a chance to elicit from him, and potentially Aaron, if he can tell the director some of the answers to this, is substantial. But I don't think, at least in my mind, that you'll get him to at least say that the president should have or possibly could be indicted.
Greg, Republicans on the committee, there's a lot of speculation. Maybe the questioning will revolve more around the origins of the counterintelligence investigation, everything that led to Mueller being put in that position in the first place. What are you expecting from them tomorrow, and how do you think Mueller will handle the Republican lines of questioning tomorrow?
Steve, I expect the Republicans, for the most part, to overreach and potentially embarrass themselves by doing so. Those issues, in my view, are red herrings. There's no factual basis for virtually any of those issues that we've heard them bring up before. And I think it's just a sideshow and a distraction. But let me just suggest one further point with respect to Bob Mueller's reluctance to answer that critical question that you posed a moment ago. I don't disagree with Bob that Mr. Mueller would be reluctant to answer the question of whether, if this wasn't the president, there was enough evidence to charge him. But I would submit that this is not the ordinary case. This is the president of the United States, who the Justice Department believes cannot be indicted while in office. And so the only remedy for potential criminal conduct on the part of the president is impeachment. In light of that reality, Congress needs, I think, this witness's opinion on that question. I've said before, and most prosecutors and former prosecutors would agree, if this was a corporate CEO, if this was a lesser politician, or if this was a mafia boss, this witness, this target would have been indicted for obstruction of justice. And I think Bob Mueller should simply answer that question as honestly and as candidly and as clearly as he can.
Yeah, Bob, is there, short of answering yes, no on the would he have been indicted question if he weren't the president, in terms of pushing it more explicitly on Congress, is that something he might say?
I'll tell you, I think that's a way to go, especially if he doesn't want to come out and answer that specific question. I do think in his testimony, he could make it really clear that the way the report was written, and again, if you've read it, it lays it out no different than other charging documents I've seen thousands of times in my career, where he is basically teeing up and saying, look, there's information here that people need to review and look at if there's a possible outcome other than what we're talking about. So I do think that's a potential way for him to go and explicitly be clear to Congress to say, look, I've laid this out for you. Under the rules that I function under, I can't do this, but you guys or whoever need to look at this to make that determination.
Okay, Robert Anderson, Greg Brower, thanks to both of you.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.